All right, here we go. I think this has been marked on people's calendars for a while to get to these chapters. Um, this is what we would consider a hinge point, right, in the Book of Mormon in the record. So it's a good place for us to kind of have the time to do this. I'm looking at the curriculum we've got doctrinal mastery. Is this the last doctrinal mastery? I think it is. I think this is your last doctrinal mastery verse for the semester.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, because we don't do the next one till Alma's 7.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. And so you've got, this will be your last doctrinal mastery lessons as far as that's concerned. And then we get to do, so you got 2 days there, some storyline, and then we get two whacks at the trials theme. You get to try to do it twice from two different angles: finding the Lord's purposes for our trials, and turning to the Lord for deliverance from trials. So you kind of come at it two different ways, the same chapter. So that's what we cover. That's what you got to look forward to. Okay, so this is so readily talking about. We kind of had this training in my region, the idea of amplifying prophetic priorities in our classroom. That was something that we talked about in our last in-service, was how do we take what is obviously coming from President Nelson or from members of the Quorum of the 12, and then trying to be a conduit or amplifying that message in the seminary classroom. This is like ready-made. This is what it seems like. Conference was just about covenants. And so here we go. Mosiah 18. We get the creation of the Lord's church among the Nephites, and a overt ordinance with the covenant to go with it. So this could be this has a lot of legs. This got room to grow and go in all sorts of different directions. So let's hear some thoughts. How would you guys approach? Is this just a straight up, let's talk ordinances and covenants? And how do you hook them if it's such a common theme that we hear all the time? How do we do this?
Here's my hook. I would write the word ordinance and covenant on the board, and I would ask students to explain to me how these two are different. And just see if they, because I don't know if even the older members of the church struggle with identifying what the difference is between an ordinance and a covenant. We almost sometimes use them interchangeably. They should be used together, but and this is just a thought exercise. If they're not different, then tell me how they're the same, right? And just have a conversation, because I just want to evaluate and gauge your understanding. Can you adequately verbalize for me the difference between an ordinance and a covenant? And then let them go and see what happens. See if somebody gets it on the first try, or if they kind of stumble with it for a little bit. And then what I would do is I would send them into Mosiah 18, and I'd probably have them start at verse 7 and read 7 through 15, and have them, once we've had a conversation, maybe I send them to the Guide to the Scriptures to look up some definitions, and we would talk about those differences. But then I want them to be able to pull out the difference between the ordinance and the covenant in these verses, because Alma's clearly teaching both. Starting verse 7 through 15, underline or circle covenant words, or underline and circle just whatever, underline one and circle the other one. What are ordinance words, right? So these words like willing and desire and sign and testimony, those are all very ordinance words. I'm willing to do something. All right, then what are you willing to do? All right, well, I'm desirous to come into the fold of God. I'm willing to bear another's burdens. I'm willing to mourn. I'm going to stand as a witness. I'm going to testify of God. And then what is the covenant? So I see the ordinance as my willingness by this performative act. Here's the covenant I'm making along with it. So I would just have that just straight on conversation, just to talk about those two words.
I like it. Go ahead, Mason?
Well, I'm going to take it in a different direction. So if you got a follow-up question, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I would take a different tact. I would I would ask my students what the difference between a church and a nation is. What are the similarities and what are the differences? Because I don't think we should assume we know why Alma is doing this. We're in the 21st century. We have this language of ordinances and covenants that has been set in us, and Alma is, I think, fundamentally trying to create a different type of community than the one that they're living in currently. And he's trying to create a community patterned after the things that Abinadi taught, which is that if we're gonna receive the blessings of God, we have to be self-sacrificing like the Messiah. We have to be like Christ. And so I think even just putting up what's a nation and what's a church, how are they similar and how are they different? Um, and that doesn't need to be a long exercise, but it sets us up to use President Oaks's talk from General Conference, where he talks about the different examples of groups that make covenants. And he talks about, I think he talked about firefighters, and he talked about, I don't know,
Police
judges maybe,
officers
but
and
police officers, right?
military and
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. That when we're talking about covenants, we're not talking about magic words, or we're not talking about magic promises or anything like that. These are ingrained in how you create a community. We have to make promises with one another. When how you and ordinances or rituals are also ingrained in how you create a community. That's how people get married. That's how we celebrate people's births and deaths. That's how we inaugurate presidents, is through ritual. And so when I think our students are being raised in a world where everything religious is weird, right? Including something like baptism and making and keeping covenants. Whereas Alma is using these things to create a community, because that's how you create community. This community needs to have promises to one another. And as human beings, we use performance and ritual in order to enact those promises. And it's not weird. It's actually the oldest way to create community. And then the question becomes, what kind of community is he trying to create? And then we look at the covenants and the substance of the covenants, and we look at the commandments that he gives to the church. What kind of community? How is it different than what they just left? And how is that? How does that teach us about our own covenants that we make? I'd do something like that.
I like it. It seems like, just for clarification, you've got in chapter 18, the ordinance and covenant conversation really does go through until about verse 16. And then that covenant making, the groupings, or the church making, the community creating, really begins in 17 and goes 17 to about 29, where he elaborates what this community is going to look like, and how they're going to interact with each other. So,
but remember that the idea of starting as an individual and becoming a community, that's a modern Western idea. In the ancient world, you were community first and then an individual. And so from the beginning, he's creating community.
right. Well, I'm
Right,
just
that's what
saying,
he's doing.
I'm just
Yeah.
saying, if you're taking Ryan's, anyway, I was just pinpointing
Yeah.
where those would be coming from. I've always had, this is just for me personally, I've always found it curious how descriptive in our modern church the wording for an ordinance is descriptive of the covenants that we are making, except for baptism. I've always found that curious. You have, even with confirmation, what's happening in that sacred ritual is telling you what's happening with what you're trying to do. Sacrament's pretty straightforward. Initiatory, it's very explained. Endowment, baptism, it just says, I baptize you in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Ghost, and you're dunked. And there's no mention of what you're promising with this. That has always caused me confusion as a youth, because I remember in seminary reading Mosiah 18. That was the first time somebody ever told me that's where the covenant, that's the promise I made at baptism. And I remember going, I didn't make that promise at baptism. Like when I was 8 years old, they said, "Do you want to be baptized?" Yeah, I'll go.
There have been times in church history where they did recite these verses at baptism,
Yeah.
before that they were baptized, and you can imagine them maybe all reciting these words at the waters of Mormon, and
Right.
so maybe that's changed a little bit.
I mean, regardless of it, that would be a little bit of a hook. I've always said to people when we start talking about ordinances and covenants, when you hear, and maybe that's what I would do, is I would actually have I would gather some of the quotes from conference, because what you often hear leaders say today is covenant making and covenant keeping. You actually hear that quite a bit. They're almost putting those in pairs now, explicitly. And I'd gather those together just so that they can kind of hear that that's a common theme that we're hearing a lot, and then ask them, what do they think that this means? And then I would ask questions like, how old were you when you realized you actually made a covenant when you were baptized? Was it at the same time that you were baptized, or was it later on in life? And then how old were you when you realized there was a covenant and you started keeping it? Because I find it interesting that those are different ages for different people, right? Having that conversation was always a big aha moment, to then go, all right, this is the covenant. If you are not aware you made this promise, I'm helping you become accountable here. This is the promise you've made. And then we can have a very real conversation of what it means to make and then keep those covenants, right? That would be my hook. I think that could be a beneficial conversation.
3 options: do one or all, or
None of them.
a
Don't
blend
do
of
all.
whatever you
None of
feel, or none of it.
Yeah.
So 19 and 20, this is its own lesson, is chapters 19 and 20.
Kind of feels like a coverage lesson, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's just titled "The Words of Abinadi Fulfilled." What's a good way to do a context lesson? That's what this feels like. It feels like this is the story. How would you guys do it? What are some ideas of doing an actual context lesson where obviously you can stop and you can pull principles out, but it does seem like we're actually trying to go from point A to point B just so we can get to chapters 21 through 24.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this would be one I would struggle with, and this is probably one I'd stay pretty close to the curriculum. Just kind of
or you just cover the story in about 10 minutes and then get going, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if there's a Book of Mormon video on this yet or not, but
You could do, so there's something creative that you can do with this. First of all, there's 3 different groups that you can be tracking through here, and you probably should bring that up again and again, right? You have Alma and his church, and they've just fled. We're going to pick up with them in a bit, but you should keep that in mind, that they're out there and that's happening simultaneously. You have Limhi and his people, right, with Noah and this whole thing that happens. You could talk about the type of leaders. One of the things that the Book of Mormon says, that we have record of these things, not just so we can do what they do, but so that we could learn from their mistakes. Noah's a pretty good example of how not to be a leader, and so are his priests.
Right.
So you have Limhi's people, and then you have the priests of Noah, who you need to introduce as a separate group again, because they're going to come back again. And one thing you can do, I've done this in the past, it might be a little tricky, but in the next couple chapters, you're going to see women and children, but specifically women, play a massive role in all the history of this.
Yeah,
they're
going to create a really interesting security for their communities about 3 different times.
I think a cool way to track kind of this story is to just look at the role of women throughout this story, which we don't get.
How are they treated?
Yeah, we don't get a ton of opportunity to do this in the Book of Mormon, but you have examples like, for example, Noah and his priests flee the Lamanites and leave their women and children. You have another group that stays and then uses their daughters as kind of to plead their case, and we may or may not feel good about that. And then you have Limhi's people who explicitly fight in behalf of their wives and their children, and that's made note of. And then you have the priests of Noah
The daughters of the
who
Lamanites.
are
Yeah.
abducting and assaulting the daughters of the Lamanites. And then the Lamanites come in, and we kind of feel like they're the aggressors here, but they're trying to get their daughters back.
Right.
And so there's this kind of through line of a story here that kind of follows how women are being treated, and sometimes we get really horrific examples of how women are treated, and sometimes we get pretty great examples of how women are treated. And in fact, by the time that Limhi and his people are actually going to be liberated and the Lord's going to free them, it's pretty clear that they've learned the lesson that they cannot live the way that Noah and his priests lived, and how that they were treating women. But that their wives and their children are going to be precious for them. So that might take a little bit of work for you to track where those instances pop up, but this is a unique opportunity in the Book of Mormon to do it, and that could make this more interesting.
There is a method that can be used when you're trying to have your students experience the informational storyline part of things, especially if you're kind of seeing that theme. If you were to follow kind of Mason's idea with this, there is a way to kind of breadcrumb trail it so that they can do it. I would occasionally create a worksheet. Surprisingly, worksheets work for the type of students that you sometimes struggle to get engaged. And so if you were to create some sort of a fill in the blank or short answer or multiple choice,
Matching.
just something that you could say, all right, I just want you to work on this, whether you work on it in pairs or whatever. And there's ways to do it so that people, if you do this too often, students will catch on and they'll just like turn their brains off. But there are a number of your students who are probably way into a kind of self-guided experience. And so if you're to follow that with Mason, you can have them go to these verses and what does this teach you about this? And have them kind of have time to kind of fill it out. I wouldn't do that for a whole period, but I would definitely do it to start. And then you can have a series of inspired questions that pull from the information to help them identify some truths and some principles from the storyline that they just spent time studying.
And then maybe some living prophet quotes ready to lead them into
a
that
discussion.
Yeah.
That's typically that's a good way sometimes when you've got just storyline and you want them to just know the story. Besides you standing up and just reciting the story, or we take turns reading the verse by verse, that's a good way to kind of give them some variety and to send them into the thing. So thoughts on that? How are we feeling? We're just moving right along.
There's another method that I use if you're ever going to do a group discussion, which you could do based on, if you pick out a theme like this and then you're saying, what does this teach us about the church today or the world today? And then you give them a group discussion. One of the things I do to keep the discussion going is I'll write the first question on the board and then give them about a minute. And then I'll write another question on the board while they're talking. And then I'll say, when you're ready, there's another question on the board. And sometimes groups run out of stuff to say really quickly and they can just turn and look. Sometimes they're taking that first question, they're still running with it. Right. And then I'll keep doing that. I might write 4 or 5 questions on the board, and it still keeps them in the discussion, but it gives me a way to guide the discussion and to prompt more discussion.
Yeah, I like it. All right. Now I actually kind of like it when the curriculum does this, where you're actually in the same block of scripture, but looking at slightly different principles. I would teach like this naturally. So I like how this just shows up in the curriculum. Covering chapters 21 through 24. This is how Limhi's people, how they experience bondage, trial, and then it's almost comparative, right? With how Alma and Helam, how their people kind of handled the trial at the same time. So what are best practices when you're covering the same group of verses, same group of chapters, but looking for themes across several days? What's a good
Well,
way to?
The Book of Mormon intentionally puts these two stories side by side so that you can see a couple. It's specifically to compare and contrast. Like, in fact, I think it's in chapter 21, verse 15. The Lord is slow to hear their cries because of their iniquities. But then if you jump to 23, it talks about I'm going to show you how the Lord is going to chasten a people. So, like, automatically you're seeing two different causes for why we have trials. And then you're going to look at the different ways that the Lord helps to deliver us from trials. And then we're going to talk about the different experiences during the trials. One of the things that's really important to point out to our students during this time period, from the time that King Noah is first introduced until Alma gets to the land of Zarahemla, we're talking about 40 years, 42 years of history. So these are stories that don't just happen. Like, we can read them in 20, 30 minutes and think, oh yeah, well, this just happened the next day, or this just happened in a week. Now we're talking about 40 years. So even if you want to knock 10 years off for the whole Noah life, you're still dealing with 30 years of history for Limhi and Alma that they're having to deal with afflictions. They're having to deal with the consequences of previous choices. And when the Lord talks about in 23 verse 21, he says, yeah, I'm gonna try their patience and their faith. That's just code for buckle up, because patience isn't developed overnight. Right. And there's some really interesting conversations you can have with students when you start talking about, yeah, let's talk about the reasons why patience is not as big a virtue as you think it is, right? Because the gaining of patience comes through experience, and those experiences are usually really hard. And so there's just some really cool ways that you can kind of compare and contrast.
Yeah, and some of the ways you do that is you can be very purposeful in which verses you're going to try to include for the discussion. I always try to get them a large enough group of verses together so that they can see. But it's almost like you can draw up on your board 3 different, columns of causes for trial, the Lord's purposes for trial, how to get through trial, like whatever it is your thing is. And then you have groups of verses that you're going to send them into. And to be honest, I feel like I could probably do the legwork for they already know this. You're going to go through the verses in the storyline quite a bit, so it's going to be a matter of, okay, now our discussion is going to be kind of 3 different parts. We're only going to discuss this one and maybe follow it all the way down to its logical conclusion to how is this relevant to me and my own personal trials, and then it's almost like hit reset. Now we're going to look at the exact same verses, but we're going to look for this theme now, all the way to its logical conclusion and its relevance for me, and do it again a 3rd time like that. This is a really interesting way to just be really intentional about the group of verses and allow them to see the layers of themes and applicable principles as you kind of work through it.
Something that I just kind of thought of that I'd never really thought of approaching this before, but because of you guys' discussion, I thought of Alma the Younger gives us this framework in Alma 32 of those who are compelled to be humble versus those that choose to be humble. That could be a nice and neat way to frame it. And then we could also bring in some of his teachings in Alma 32, because his point there is about how do we get to faith? Because his people are coming to him and saying, well, we don't see any evidence for this. And Alma says, well, how do you get to faith? And you can take this route to faith, and we see that with Limhi's people. They take the hard route to faith. But eventually, they say they want to make the same covenant that Alma's people made all the way back in the waters of Mormon. But Alma's people, they start with faith and they stay with faith. It doesn't change the fact that they're going to have trials, but it dramatically changes how they experience those trials and what they mean in terms of their relationship to God and to each other.
How do you
And so
how do you do that, Mason, without it turning into an Alma 32 lesson? Like what are best practices to bring something like a completely
so
different book and chapter verses to do
yeah,
this?
so I would pick just a block of verses from Alma 32, and that's what I would start with. And I'd say,
Yeah, it's like maybe 2 verses, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and then maybe his what he describes faith as.
Yeah.
And I'd say to in these stories, we're gonna look at how in a hard world we can have faith. And that's my question that I'm asking over 2 days. And we're gonna ask it with this group, and we're gonna ask it with this group. And if I feel the need to bring in some more Alma 32, we can, but using scripture to frame scripture, I think is a really cool way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then yeah,
That that's another
but
good way to do those 2 days, right? Is just say we're only going to talk about Limhi and their experience on one day, and we'll talk about Alma and his
because
experience.
they end up in the same place,
They do.
but they have very different journeys in the process, physically, spiritually, all of those things.
I think another, and I'm just thinking of this as well, something that kind of comes to mind that is very relevant to students is the question of fairness,
Yeah.
right? This teenagers are all about their internal sense of justice, right? Something has got to be fair. And my kids, whenever they would fight, it's who started it and what was my justified response. Sometimes, most of the times, it's an escalation of, of response, but but in our immaturity, we're constantly asking the question about fairness, right? And so if we were to just start with like a case study and say, all right, here's the situation. We're not even going to give backstory. We're just going to say person X does thing Y, and as a result, they went to prison. Okay, tell me fair or not fair. And like you could do a number of those, right? And just kind of, and here's person, action, consequence, and just
And
do
maybe
like a list of,
maybe escalate them from like just like whatever to make them more and more gospel centered as you work through it a little bit. Just so
yeah, you
you're
could start with your kids, like my child X
yeah,
pushed child Y, and child Y retaliated by punching him,
yeah,
right? Fair or not fair? And
right.
like you could have these conversations, and then escalate it to where we start getting to some places of, all right, a people kill a prophet and go into bondage. Fair or
Fair or
not?
not fair. that,
Just,
that could be really interesting. And I'd probably end with one that's super like
well, no, but that's where
pointed,
Alma
super
comes
pointed
in
to
is,
them though. Like say, and here you have a modern teenager who's trying to live their best self and they're trying to, do what God says. And mom gets cancer. Fair or not fair? Like I would like bring it right
yeah,
down to
that's the Alma hook, right? The
right.
Alma hook is, here's a covenant community that has, in fact, they were persecuted. We have our own church history here. They're persecuted for their beliefs. They leave, they start their own city. They're not bothering anybody. They're living righteously. They're keeping their covenants. All of a sudden, an army of Lamanites just chasing the Limhites, right? Like the irony is that the army is going after the group that fairly has been persecuted and in bondage, and come across this group that has done nothing wrong, and now their bondage seems to be worse. Fair, not fair. Like, and then we hear from kids all the time, like, yeah, I see my friends, they're not keeping the commandments, they seem to be really happy. I'm keeping the commandments, I seem to be miserable. That doesn't seem fair. And just
Yeah,
and just have some conversations about what it is that we're supposed to learn from going through trials.
it it's pretty clear that like we could uncover some painful stuff in these lessons when we're talking about trials, when we're talking about fairness. Some of our students have, I mean, every one of our students, but some of our students have legitimately been victimized, and you may or may not know it, but have experienced things that were not fair and never will be fair, and that's just how that is, right? And we have, so in theology there's this question the problem of evil. They call it theodicy. Why do we have a just God who is all powerful, who is all loving, who is all knowing, but then evil things happen? How can we square that circle? And I would caution trying to do that. There are ways to do that, but when a kid is asking that question, oftentimes they're asking it from experience, and they don't need theology in response. They don't need your doctrinal explanation of why sometimes bad things happen to good people. What they need is faith in Jesus Christ. And you look at the example of Job. Job demands God come and answer for why all this unfairness has happened, and God doesn't answer. What he does is he shows them the expanse of creation. And because he has had this moment with God, this pure moment with God, he can say, thy ways are just. I don't get it, but I feel it, right? And the best thing we can do is give them an experience with Jesus Christ.
This is a perfect link to then point to Christ. Like if we want to go back and look at Isaiah 53 and re-examine the suffering servant poem that Abinadi preaches to these wicked priests.
And the
They
Alma is
obviously
preaching.
they obviously missed it. Alma totally gets it.
Yeah, well,
And that's what helps them to have patience and faith, because they don't cease to pray in their hearts. The Lord comforts them and bears up their burdens. But why does he do it? Because he's already he's suffered it for them.
He's there with them.
He knows what it feels like to go through it, and he's going to strengthen us to not survive it, but to thrive in it.
I think verse 15 of chapter 24 would be a really great hook as well, as how did they submit cheerfully and with patience to their bondage and suffering.
And who does that sound like? How does that sound like Christ?
Yeah, that's bringing you back to why this people specifically know how to do this. And it's because of Alma teaching them what Abinadi had already taught and taking them back to those. So, all right, there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. This is the beginning of the church. This is just as important of a group of chapters as we have anywhere else in the Book of Mormon. So, take your time, slow down a little bit. I know it's the end of the year. Keep on keeping on. We'll get there together.
There's some good stories coming to keep our attention.
Yeah. All right.